Little bit of a different start to our episode today, Hunter. And I'm going to ask you, as well as all of our listeners, if you're able to. Obviously, if you're driving, please don't do this. But bear with me because let's do a little bit of an exercise. Hunter, I want you to close your eyes.
You want me to close my eyes?
Close your eyes.
Okay.
Yes, it's a mental exercise. Close your eyes and picture a world map.
Okay.
Once you have that map in your head, describe this map to me. And listener, feel free to just sort of picture a world map and sort of go through the same process. Obviously, you can't tell me what it looks like.
Well, it's tricky because I ask this question to people all the time and I ask students this question. And so now I have all kinds of maps just like running through my head. But the one that I would default to shows, it's a world map, right?
A world map, yes. Yeah, not like a map of Oregon or the United States, just a plain old world map.
It shows the world where the Atlantic would sort of be in the middle-ish. And it's, I even know what projection it is, but maybe we shouldn't get there yet. But it's sort of the kind of map that you might see on National Geographic or something like that.
Okay.
Or the Goods Atlas or something like that. And, I guess the map is divided into countries, although I can imagine the same map that shows different landforms and stuff. I can open my eyes now, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I had to wager a guess, Hunter, I would say that your continental land masses were distorted in some way, correct?
They'd have to be, right?
They'd have to be, right?
If I'm thinking of a two-dimensional map of the globe, they'd have to be distorted in some way. Absolutely.
Yeah. So all that's to say is everybody who just partook in that exercise, including you, Hunter, including myself when I've done that exercise, has a mental map of the world that is largely based on something that sort of these maps that have sort of filtered in through our society, our textbooks, everything from however we were educated about maps in the world throughout history, right? And there's one very specific map that I think most people probably pictured in their head. And that is, do you know what map I'm talking about?
Are you talking about the Mercator projection?
It's very likely the Mercator projection. Yes.
And I'll just indicate it's not the one I had in mind, but I know what you're talking about, of course. Yeah.
As soon as you said, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said one thing and I was like, he is not picturing the Mercator. All right. So we are talking about map projections today. Today is kind of a little bit of a wonkier episode. It's more heavily based in geographic sort of thought, I would argue, as compared to sort of our usual episodes, which is about like IKEA or Greenland or something like that.
Yeah, we're usually taking a geographic lens, and this time we're talking about geography.
Right. Yeah. And really the reason why is because maps have been used as a way to sort of portray our world in various ways that can often be, I would argue every map that's on a flat surface is inaccurate to a degree, right? They have to be.
It can only be inaccurate, in fact.
Can only be. Yeah. And so sometimes this is intentional, right? People want to emphasize certain things for either completely normal reasons or sometimes more nefarious reasons, such as wishing to claim land that maybe isn't theirs.
A lot of that.
Yeah. But more often than not, it's simply just been a way to project our sort of sphere onto a flat surface. And so obviously, I think I've used this inside a past episode, but if somebody wants to, unpeel an orange and smash it down to the ground, you can sort of see how that distorts what was a sphere into a flat surface. And so that's not the first time I'm going to use that analogy. So hold on to that thought.
Okay, we'll come back to the orange.
Yeah. And so all that's to say is we're going to talk a lot about maps. There's going to be a lot of different sort of map projections we're talking about. We're going to talk a lot about how things are differently sized, how things are differently looking. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's going to be some fun graphics thrown up so that you can sort of help guide sort of this visual sort of narrative for you. If you're listening, we're going to do our very best to sort of describe sort of what we're seeing. And hopefully that will help you understand sort of some of the changes. And so that's my caveat right there. And of course, as we're talking about these projections, we'll name them as well. So you're also, if you're at a computer, you can just pull them up on Wikipedia or whatever, or Google. And so
I wanted to just emphasize something that you said that, when we're talking about you can only show some kind of representation of the world, that you can't show the world as it is on a globe in 2 dimensions. There's always somebody making the map. And even if it's if it's showing up on your computer, whatever, there's somebody who's put that together. And so the cartographer makes a decision about what to preserve and what to distort. And I know we're going to talk about this stuff, but I think it's important to say at the outset that people make decisions about which projection to use, and it's going to emphasize one thing over the other. And so that's not an accidental choice oftentimes, right?
Absolutely.
That tells a different story, a different projection of the world, tells a different story about the world, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, because even something as, I think when you did your exercise, Hunter, you had mentioned that the Atlantic Ocean was in the center, right? It's a very, I would say, US European centric sort of viewpoint.
That's right.
But obviously we're a sphere, right? And so there are maps that don't show the Atlantic at the center. Sometimes it's, the Indian Ocean, if we're just using ocean. Sometimes it's the Pacific Ocean, right? Sometimes it's the Arctic Ocean, right? All of these things can be sort of the center of our world. And that's a very specific point of view that somebody is using intentionally or not. It's going to distort the world in a specific way.
Well, and then on top of that, maps carry a lot of authority for most people. And so if a lot of people will see something on the map and they'll think, oh, that's the world. That's the way the world is. An extreme example of the authority people give maps is if somebody's driving down the street with their app and it says there's a bridge there and they see a sign that says bridge out, and then they drive into the river. I mean, this has happened in real life before, because people give so much authority to maps.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that is very well known to have happened. In fact, I think The Office, the television show, the US version, had a joke almost exactly to that sort of line of thought that you just had, Hunter. Well, let's go ahead and dive into sort of our episode today. We're going to start as usual with history, because I think while map projections are a thing today, what we're going to find is that people have been trying to interpret our world for a long time in a lot of different ways. And so let's go all the way. We're not going to spend too much time, going through the depths of history, but I thought it might be worthwhile going all the way back to prehistoric times, because there have been some documented efforts to create rudimentary maps and just sort of ground ourselves a little bit in that. And of course, I would argue calling some of these maps might be a little generous, but I think regardless, the intent was there to actually create something that's visually, spatially recognizing our world or their world and their place. And so, Hunter, quick question for you.
Yes.
How old do you think the oldest known map might be?
The oldest known existing map?
Yeah, or some interpretation of it, I guess.
I think there's a few answers to this. I think that before the Common Era, there's some existing maps that have been etched on stone. Mm-hmm. And, the caves in Lascaux, for example, or something may represent some kind of spatial relationship, which would make it a map. So pretty old. Right.
Yeah. So according to what I can find, and I hid this from my notes from you so that you wouldn't be able to
I
cheat.
See.
So according to historians, a map-like, that's a key word, map-like, representation of a mountain, river, valleys, and routes around Pavlov in the current sort of country of Czech Republic or Czechia, carved on a mammoth tusk, has been dated to around 25,000 BCE.
That's a long time ago.
It's a long time. Now, of course, whether that's actually a map, I think is still a little bit debated. However, some form of map has been seen within the ancient Aboriginal tribes in Australia. Mm-hmm. An ancient culture that would have been set in sort of modern day Ukraine area today, and even on caves within the area we now call Spain. And so these would all, at this point, we're still in sort of prehistoric times. This is all sort of on or before 10,000 BCE. And so I think suffice it to say, regardless of whether that very first map of around 25,000 BCE was actually a map or not, I think there's been a relation with people trying to spatially sort of figure out where they are in the world so that they can have, well, for any purpose, right? Navigation, boundaries, just figuring out where things are, generally figuring out sort of how they fit within sort of their surroundings. I think that's always been something that early humans have been trying to do.
Or maybe to tell stories even.
Or even to tell stories, absolutely. Maps have a huge influence in story making and sort of being able to tell sort of, well, the spatialness of any given story.
And of course, these are just the surviving maps that we're able to identify as, map-like, that There may have well been all kinds of maps and different civilizations and different cultures throughout the world that just we don't know about because
Right.
it's too far back in history and there's no record of it. But that's entirely possible.
Absolutely. But let's go ahead and jump ahead a few millennia and get to maps that are sort of more in line with what we're talking about today. So, another question for you, Hunter.
Yes.
Which ancient civilization do you think would be responsible for some of the earliest, or perhaps the earliest, and more accurate world maps?
I'm guessing maybe the Mesopotamians because this is where cities first arose. I'm thinking of the Egyptians and the Greeks as well. These are my. I know that's
I think
not
your
one
first answer nailed it. It's Babylonian.
Okay.
Some of the original world maps were Babylonian. So these were sort of created using really kind of accurate surveying techniques. There's a clay tablet from Gosur, which is about from around 25th to 24th century BCE that shows river valleys, hills, and a plot of land owned by somebody named Azala, I think maybe a king, which is kind of an important sort of thing to know here because it's actually delineating sort of what's whose and what belongs to who.
Claiming
Very important
territory.
concept for maps.
Yep.
The tablet included sort of cuneiform inscriptions and sort of marks and for cardinal directions, right? So maybe not quite north, south, east, west, but sort of that sort of concept filtering through. The first world map, also by the Babylonians, would have been from around 600 BCE. And it depicts the world as a circular shape surrounded by water, which is kind of interesting. Thinking about this is a long time ago, even though a circle is not a sphere, it's kind of interesting thinking that maybe people were even already thinking about the world in sort of not a rectangular manner, which is what a lot of our maps depict today. I just thought that was a super interesting ancient aspect.
Well, there's a lot of symbolic power of the circle as well, so that might figure into it as well.
Right. It is also interesting to note that the earliest world map by the Babylonians did omit certain peoples such as the Persians and Egyptians. I don't know if there was a political reason for that. Probably. There are lots of different world maps that were created throughout history, usually emphasizing the places where the map was from.
Mm-hmm.
For example, have you ever heard of a person named Hecataeus?
I'm not sure I'm overly familiar with Hecataeus.
So Hecataeus, he was an ancient Greek cartographer, geographer, whatever sort of, they might have called themselves back then. He created a world map that pictured Europe and Asia, but it overemphasized Europe, likely because Hecataeus didn't and couldn't possibly know the true extent of Asia at the time. But it also, I think what's most interesting about Hecataeus' map is that it starts sort of the process of what map projections continue to do forever from that point on, which is starts to distort areas of our world in ways that perhaps show bias about where the map maker is from, which maybe is sort of completely natural and normal. I don't think Hecataeus had any sort of nefariousness behind it, but it's obviously showing Europe is this great big landmass because that's where Hecataeus knows. And he's going to have much more detailed information about Europe than anywhere in Asia.
Well, and people tend to put themselves at the center of the world when they're mapping things.
And guess where Greece is on Hecataeus' map?
Pretty close to the center, I bet.
Almost right in the middle. Yes, absolutely. So not a surprise at all. Hecataeus' map. Also, it's showing sort of a rounded, sort of curved curvature, sort of illustrating the ocean, sort of surrounding the landmasses of Asia, Europe, and even I believe even Africa, although it's not called Africa at the time. And I believe it's Hecataeus' map that shows the Nile River as well. So illustrating that the Nile River was very prominent even back then.
But this is not a map that exists still, right?
I mean, there's
representations of it.
There's representations of it.
But there's not one that this Greek individual made that's still hanging around.
No, that's a really good question. I think there's some early illustrations of sort of what Hecataeus actually did, but anything that he drew on sort of papyrus at the time, paper substance, is probably long gone, right? It has
Yeah,
to be.
Ptolemy is the same way. Also,
Mhm.
very well known geographer, cartographer from ancient Greece, and there's all these references to Ptolemy's maps, but they're recreated from notes hundreds and hundreds of
Right.
years.
Exactly. And so I think Hecateus is the exact same way. I think a lot of the Babylonian maps are the same way. These are all things that people were able to interpret based on sort of the written language that was inscribed somewhere for them. Because Ptolemy does have some maps that do look, there are some original looking maps from Ptolemy's maps that if somebody recreated them, they did a lot of hard work to make it look like it came from that era.
Yeah, that's what I think was being done
Yeah.
in sort of the 700s, 800s, 900s into the medieval times in Europe. That was
Right.
recreating maps to sort of emulate the world at the turn from the Common Era before the Common Era.
Right. There is one map I want to talk about before we sort of move on, and that is a map from the Han Dynasty in China. Let's get out of our Euro bubble for a little bit, or Mesopotamian bubble maybe, and go to the other side of sort of the planet. And a lot of civilizations were making world maps. This isn't just sort of about Greece or Mesopotamia. And so the Han Dynasty in China also attempted to create various regional and world maps. And one map I thought was very interesting. And again, this will be on the YouTube video. You can sort of see what I'm talking about. I'll try and describe it as best as possible for listeners. But one such map from the year 168 BCE showed, I would argue, remarkable accuracy in rivers and topology for a region. And this, again, I don't know, maybe this is somebody's interpretation as well. It looks pretty ancient to me, the actual map. And I think for my part, it is, for how old it is just a remarkable level of accuracy that the Han Chinese, cartographers were able to depict sort of where their rivers were going and how they were sort of flowing around their region.
Was this one that was carved in stone?
It was carved in stone.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think I know.
Mhm.
I can picture in my mind, I think, what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was carved in stone. Again, I think there's always a debate on how much of these are interpretations or recreations of sort of things. This one does, I would argue, look like it might actually be a legitimate sort of find. And the Han Chinese or Han Dynasty was known for having a lot of things preserved in very particular ways, so that they have lasted a lot longer than maybe places, for example, in Babylonia, which very, very little lasted from the Babylonian
That's right.
empire. That wasn't just sort of ruins, right? Okay. Let's go ahead and leave behind ancient history.
Okay.
And we're going to jump to our very favorite map in the world, Hunter, the Mercator map.
Oh boy, here we go.
But first, we got to run through some quick ads. So, I guess enjoy these ads and we will be right back. And we're back. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. We are talking about map projections today. We just left a bunch of history, and now we're going to jump to, my very favorite map projection, the Mercator projection. That's a joke, by the way. But Hunter, can you describe for us what the Mercator map projection is, and sort of, describe sort of how it looks, what it's doing, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it's a rectangle, first of all. Which the world is not rectangular, but this map is. It is a map that has lines of longitude and latitude that meet at right angles. And it is a map that distorts the size of land masses the closer you get to the poles, and the further away you get from the Mercator, from the equator, not the Mercator, the equator. And so in a map like this, Greenland looks bigger than Africa.
Absolutely. It's huge.
Which is totally not. Yeah.
Yeah. We're hold on to that thought, Hunter. We're going to come back and talk about that exact comparison in a minute here. But let's go talk about sort of how the Mercator projection, came to be, why it's so prominent, who made it. So created by Gerardus Mercator, a German Netherlandish cartographer and geographer. He created a mathematical projection for a world map in 1569, today known as the Mercator projection. So this is not a new map. It's a very old map by sort of our current standards, right? This would now be almost 500 years old. Today, amongst, I would argue amongst cartographic and geography professionals, the Mercator projection is kind of a joke. It's not something that people use, and if you do use it, you're kind of maligned for it.
Although it is widely used, like most web-based mapping uses the Mercator projection.
But it's very widely used, right? Yeah. So, but let's talk a little bit about the Mercator projection, because I think I would argue it's still a very famous. It's as you mentioned, it's a very well-known global map. I think when we went through that exercise in the beginning, I think most people probably pictured a Mercator projection in their head at first. Even if they were very intentional about wanting to pick something else, that might have first flashed in their head because it's so omnipresent at least within the United States. I can't speak for people, in other places around the world. At least within the United States, the Mercator projection has become very omnipresent. And so at its most basic, you had already mentioned this, the Mercator projection is a cylindrical projection where the meridians are straight and the perpendiculars and are perpendicular to the parallels, right? So there's all those 90-degree angles. It's representing our world as a flat rectangle, which is very opposite of what our actual world is. And so this stretches things out near the poles, as you had already mentioned, and tries to maintain as much accuracy near the equator. And so things such as, Europe and Canada get distorted as being very large. Places like Africa might be a little bit more accurate because it's on the equator, but is represented as being much smaller. And so the accuracy comparison between the two is wildly off.
The shapes of the land masses are somewhat accurate, but the area is not preserved very well. And I'm sure you're going to tell us why this was invented in the first place, right?
Well, let's dive right into it. So the big reason why this was invented, and it's actually kind of, when this was made, this was actually kind of an ingenious map to make, especially given the era of sailing and navigation that was going on around the planet. And so the Mercator map that allows rhumb lines, which is sort of constant sailing courses, lines that, whatever, to be represented as straight lines, which aided in navigation. So if you were to go from, let's say, Greenland down to South America on a globe, you're probably going to have like a large curve that would actually be represented as sort of what the actual sailing path would be. On a Mercator map, that can just be a straight line. So it really helps identify sort of where you're going and helps get people from point A to point B without any sort of confusing sort of navigational quandaries around navigating on a ball.
So it's invented for ship navigation, basically.
It's invented for ship navigation, right? And so is intended for navigational use. And as indicated by the map's title, which translated from Latin is quote, new and more complete representation of the terrestrial globe properly adapted for use in navigation. That's all the Mercator map was ever intended for. It was never intended to be sort of the baseline default map of our planet, but that's kind of what it became, right? So eventually, gradually over the next couple hundred years, the Mercator map was adopted for naval charts. Sort of by the end of the 17th century, it was kind of the baseline, the default for navigation. And you can kind of see why after describing all of this. It was kind of an act of genius. The fact that Mercator was able to invent this map in the 1500s was really, I would say, very smart. But it was this initial popularity and ingenuity that made the map also one of the most popular maps even into today. And so I would argue everybody's Google search is a little bit different. However, if any of our listeners right now, including you, Hunter, if you go to Google image search, I think it's image.google.com or something like that, and simply type in world map, I would be willing to wager a lot of money that the top 3 maps that come up would all be Mercator projection maps. As a geographer, Hunter, yours might actually be a little bit different, so I'm not going to put money on your search. And this is weird because I think despite its usefulness in the past, the map is very much not accurate today. And we have tools that show much more accurate maps. And so let's go ahead and jump back to, actually, I saw you doing a search, Hunter. Can you tell me what your top 3 maps were?
So the first one that's of course for sale is not a Mercator
Ah,
projection, but it looks like a variation on it. And if I scroll down a little bit, more than half of the maps, it seems like a lot of them are compromised maps, but a bunch of them are Mercator projections.
yeah,
Yes.
it's got to be right. It's
Yep.
just it's so like everywhere out there, a company will have a world map on their website showing all of their office locations, and those are usually Mercator, all that kind of stuff.
Or think about when there's a news broadcast, maybe it's on one of the major US networks, or maybe it's the BBC or from someplace else. There's often a map in the background. So pay attention to those because that's very interesting.
Probably going to be Mercators. So let's go back and talk a little bit about Greenland. You had already sort of mentioned Greenland earlier in the episode. I told you to put a pin in that. Let's go back to that pin. So a few weeks ago, Hunter, we had an entire episode all about Greenland. And Greenland is the world's largest non-continental island. And we talked a little bit about this exact topic on that episode. And so, Hunter, as you look at a Mercator map, you already described this a little bit, but I'll have you re-describe it. About how big would you say Greenland is based on the Mercator?
Compared to...
compared to other land masses, yeah.
It's the biggest thing on the map unless Antarctica is represented. And if Antarctica is represented, Antarctica looks enormous. It looks like it's got more land than maybe most of the world combined.
Right.
And then because we have this visual hierarchy in our culture looking at the top, Greenland's also at the top. So that also amplifies its sort of importance. It's really big. It's at the top. It's sort of in the middle-ish.
Yeah, it's top center. It's sort of the first thing that draws your attention. It's very bright because it's usually illustrated as snowy, so it's very white. And it's to your point earlier, it looks about the same size as Africa,
or bigger
sometimes, right? It looks absolutely mammoth. Now, of course, we know that Greenland is not actually as big as it appears because now we're able to very precisely measure land masses. And so the Greenland you described, this very big, massive blob up in the sort of the north central area, would appear to be about the size of Africa, which Africa, if people didn't know, is about 12 million square miles in size. Greenland is actually only about 800,000 square miles, so less than the single African country of Algeria. And so, again, it's just picturing this map, you can sort of see how distorted things get when Greenland on this map looks as big or bigger than Africa, is less than a 12th the size of that continent.
Yeah. You could fit like 12 or 13, I think, different Greenlands into Africa. And I think the Mercator projection exaggerates the size of Greenland by over 500%.
Right. And to your point earlier, it exaggerates Antarctica as well. If Antarctica is showing that it takes up sort of a massive area on sort of the southern sort of part of the map, to the point where you're like, oh my God, like if you didn't know any better, you'd be like, there's so much land down there. That's bigger than the entire world.
Right.
The same can be said for Canada, of course, Russia, Alaska. In fact, I would argue for people here in the United States, I would argue that and for Alaska, even though it is the largest state in the United States, I would argue that most people often think of it as being roughly half the size of the contiguous United States. And that's because the Mercator map, as you look at it, it sort of looks like if you were to just drag it on down, overlay it on top of the United States, it looks like it would take up all of the Western states, right? In reality,
Well, Canada and Canada and Russia are the biggest countries anyway by land area, but yeah, the visual cue is that they're even larger than they are. And then Europe is pretty far north, so it gets bigger than it generally is as well. So it represents the size of Europe pretty well. Yeah.
And going back to Alaska, Alaska it's only a bit more than 1/6 the size of the contiguous United States. So again, you can sort of see how this is distorting things, and it's making people, Alaska is really large. Canada is really large. Russia is really large. However, they're not nearly as large as the Mercator projection is sort of illustrating them to be. And that's very important because, well, I guess let's talk a little bit about it. Hunter, why might having this map projection be problematic for the perception of the world and maybe the prominence of the specific areas that it makes larger.
Well, I mean, think it centers and exaggerates the size of Europe, for example. So that's that's a particular choice that is made. If you're using this map, you're choosing to use a map that emphasizes this particular bias. It gives people a faulty idea of how big different areas are. So if they're thinking about the concerns of the world, or the area and things like that, sometimes they rank it by how big something is, and so this provides a misperception. It can be conducive to misperceiving how big different parts of the world are.
Yeah, I mean, simple things like, for example, the Amazon rainforest or Brazil come off as a lot smaller on the Mercator map. And as much as, maybe we like to not think that it influences our sort of decisions and our biases as much, but size matters. And so when we see something that looks smaller than, say, Canada, we often think, oh, well, it's not as important. Oh, it's just a small little area. It's fine. Oh, it's, smaller. We don't have to really pay attention to it. That kind of stuff sort of filters in through cultural biases, societal biases. And so something like the Mercator map, which has propagated this idea that Greenland and Europe and Canada and Russia and even the United States to a degree is so large compared to South America and Africa and Southeast Asia and all these other places, I think actually does matter and sort of helps influence sort of maybe the prominence of what's important and what's not.
Well, and if you think about the fact that a lot of thematic maps, so a thematic map might be mapping rainfall, precipitation, or it might be mapping affluence, or any number of different things, it's going to give a larger visual cue to parts of the world that aren't as big. And so it's really going to skew your understanding of those particular themes. And I'm sure if Mercator were around today, you'd be thinking, why are you using my map for this? Because this is for sailing. This isn't really a good way of showing this data, I don't think.
Absolutely. So, okay, we've talked a lot about the Mercator projection. Let's turn to some of the other world projections, and so that people can sort of have maybe an idea of some alternatives out there. But before we do that, we got to hit our final ad break. And we're back. We're going to finish off our episode on map projections. This is the Geography is Everything podcast. So to finish off our episode on map projections, I thought it would be fun to sort of talk about some of the other global map projections that, maybe help define our world maybe a little bit better. There's some arguments here for and against that. And to start, I think, what would be fun was to start with, I would argue, is maybe the second most famous world map projection. Hunter, do you know what map projection I might be talking about?
It's either the Peters projection. It's probably not that. It's like the Robinson or Winkle triple or something like that. We're going to talk about the Peterson projection, the Gall-Peters projection, I should say. But it absolutely is the Robinson projection. And so the Robinson projection, created by Arthur H. Robinson in 1963, was developed in response to a request from Rand McNally, the map company. I'm not sure what they do today. Maybe they still make paper maps. And Rand McNally has used the Robinson projection in general purpose world maps since 1963. Now, Robinson would go on and publish the details of the projection in 1974, essentially making it, quote unquote, open source sort of map projection for anybody else to use. And because of that, National Geographic began using the map in 1988. And this would be replaced by the Winkle triple map in 1997. Which is actually older than the Robinson projection.
Which is older, but, we're not really going to talk about the Winkle triple much on today's episode. Actually, this is going to be the only time we're really going to talk about it. But I would say it's a bit more accurate, even though it's still comparable to the Robinson, although accuracy is always a little bit of a loaded term there.
I think what they both do is they instead of preserving either shape or distance or angles or land area, they kind of fudge in every direction, which provides maybe a more aesthetically pleasing version of the world to look at, which is why Atlas companies are using it, which is why National Geographic is using one of these sort of compromise projections, because it's kind of more satisfying to look at for most people, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. typically, if I'm making a world map of whatever, because I make a lot of maps about various things, it will be a Winkle triple projected map.
Mhm.
And so, like all projections we're talking about today, you sort of already alluded to this, Hunter, the Robinson projection displays the entire world at once and does distort things in various ways. And so it's kind of designed to offer a compromise depicting the globe. And in some ways, it's more accurate, right? It's going to show things as in a more accurate size. And so let's go back and use our Greenland example. If you have a Robinson projection map open, you can sort of see the ends of the map sort of curve around, sort of illustrating that this is a globe, not a flat rectangular surface. And you'll see that Greenland is now much smaller. And in fact, it's kind of feels squished, right? It's kind of looks like it's sort of like been like pressed up against sort of the edge there. And this is doing two things. One, it's giving a more accurate sort of size of the actual landmass. Probably still not entirely accurate, but more accurate than the Mercator. But it's compromising based on sort of actual accuracy of the land area that might exist, right? So the Mercator projection does that very well. It's sort of showing how things actually look on that island. The Robinson projection, not great for that. Same with the Winkle triple. It's also going to sort of squish that up top. Though, so this sort of gets repeated around sort of the planet, right? So Africa now looks much larger than compared to other sort of land masses, and certainly compared to Greenland. Again, the accuracy of all this is still not going to be perfect because you can just never fully realize a globe onto a flat map. It's just never going to happen.
You have to change something.
You have to change something. And so let's go ahead and leave Robinson behind. Let's jump to a map called the Gall-Peters projection. Hunter, have you ever heard of this map?
I am familiar with the Gall-Peters projection. Yes.
So this is a fun one because if you're inside of if you're in the cartographic or geographic space, I feel like the Gall-Peters projection gets a bit of a negative reputation. I think, be honest, I think a little undeserved. It's just a map projection, just showing things.
They're all wrong, right?
They're all wrong. So let's go ahead and talk a little about it. So the Gall-Peters projection is like the Mercator projection, a rectangular equal area map projection. So there's not going to show any sort of rounded curves. Then again, this is very similar to the Mercator. And like the Mercator, it's going to distort most shapes on the planet, just like every map, really. It's going to, distort the size of different things. However, unlike the Mercator map, which makes the north and south poles very large, this projection compresses them to pretty extreme small sizes and stretches things out at the equator to make them look much longer, right? So it's sort of stretching things out at the equator. In fact, the Gall-Peters projection is most accurate at about the 45 degrees north and south latitudes. Conveniently, Hunter, that's almost exactly where we're located, right here in Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I think we're at like 45:18 or something like that. And so this map, which was named after James Gall and Arno Peters, Gall first introduced the projection in 1855 and then published it in 1885. So it's older than the Robinson projection. But it would be Peters, Arno Peters, who would popularize it in the 1970s with his quote unquote Peters world map. And the term Gall-Peters projection was first used by Arthur Robinson of Robinson map projection fame in 1986.
Right. He's thinking, well, just because Peters promoted it and marketed it doesn't mean that Gall shouldn't get some credit for this.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I think it was a little, presumptuous of Arno Peters to just go ahead and name it his own just because he's popularizing it. Well, but that's a different argument.
If you've seen the map or if you're looking at the map, it does look like it's stretched out from north to south, but the areas are pretty well preserved. So if you're looking at that map, if we want to use our Greenland and continent of Africa example, the continent of Africa is really that big compared to the rest of the world, more or less. And, the shape is not correct, but the area is preserved much better than the Peters projection.
Right. It shows
the Mercator projection.
Mercator, yeah.
Right.
It shows Africa as absolutely mammoth, which Africa is absolutely mammoth. It's a huge continent, much bigger than I think most people realize because of things like the Mercator. And so this is sort of maybe setting that tone a little bit more accurately, though, of course, as we're saying this, all maps are going to be inaccurate to a degree. That's just going to be the way it is. Today, The Gall-Peters projection is used by quite a few organizations. I saw that it was used and promoted by UNESCO, the United Nations sort of organization that decides, for example, where World Heritage sites are located. Apparently, although I can't say this for certain, it's widely used in British schools. And it was adopted by the U.S. state of Massachusetts and the Boston Public Schools in March of 2017 as their standard map.
Oh, that I didn't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, interesting, right? Again, I don't know. That's pretty recent. I don't know how quickly all this stuff filters in. So maybe it's not quite at the apex of sort of all maps, but that's sort of, what I could find. But like I had mentioned earlier, it does have some controversy sort of surrounding it. So became, sort of in the late 20th century, the political implications of the map sort of became like, well, now you're making the US and Europe look so small compared to Africa, and that makes us feel bad. And that's kind of sort of where a lot of those feelings stem from. It's like, well, the Mercator was doing this for centuries. So,
right. They think, well, this map is wrong. But I mean, any two-dimensional representation of the globe is going to be wrong. So the problem isn't that it's wrong. It's that somebody doesn't like the way the choices that were made.
Totally. There's actually, I think, have you ever watched that show West Wing?
I've not seen it.
All right. So I've not seen, I've only seen really this clip because.
Oh, hold on. I have seen the clip you're talking about. However.
Yes, exactly. So there's a really funny clip, listener, on West Wing about sort of this exact topic about map projections. And at one point, and I don't remember the characters involved, so I'm not going to try and get through that. But at one point, some of the characters are talking about different map projections and how the world is sort of portrayed. And I remember at one point, I think they talk about the Gall-Peters projection because it's so different and sort of like what it's doing. And then at one point, one of the characters was like, well, what if we do this? And they flip the map upside down so that south is up and north is south, or south is up, north is down. And it's just a very humorous scene as people just grasp like, well, that's not right, but it's not wrong. South does not mean
it's not how we usually conceptualize the world, but we think about the planet as north and south when in fact those are just arbitrary distinctions. And
absolutely. Yep. Yeah. So let's sort of finish today's episode on talking about the final projection here that I have, which is called the Good Homolocene projection. Hunter, do you know what this map projection is?
I think I do. I think it's the one, if we go back to your orange comment from earlier, that looks kind of like somebody peeled an orange and laid it out flat. Absolutely.
So this is perfect analogy, because I actually had that in my notes that I was going to use. So if you look at this map projection, listener, it's still flat, but it attempts to carve and cut up the planet so that there are more accurate land masses based on sort of what it would look like if you actually did take a ball or sphere and sort of lay it out flat. In fact, the easiest way to describe it is that orange analogy, whereas if you peel that orange perfectly so it's all connected and you press it down on a flat surface, you're going to see that there are gaps in your peel. And that's sort of what this map is doing, right? It's sort of the orange peel, I would argue, of map projections. The map projection was developed in 1923 by John Paul Good to provide an alternative to the Mercator projection for portraying global aerial relationships. Good offered variations of the interruption scheme for emphasizing the world's land and world's oceans. So some variants include extensions that repeat regions in two different sort of lobes of the interrupted map in order to show Greenland or Eastern Russia. At its base form, listener, if you have this sort of in front of you, Greenland is literally split in half, and so that's sort of one of the ways that this is distorting the planet, right? It's trying to get very accurate measurements and sort of sizes and shapes of all the places, but because of the way that it's sort of breaking out the world, there's going to be some land masses that are simply split in half. There's no way to get around that.
I mean, we seem much more comfortable splitting up the ocean and making the seams in the ocean, but if that happens on land, that becomes something else, because we inhabit the land, and the oceans make up most of the world. So those are usually where the breaks in. Those are often where the breaks in maps happen, because people are more focused on the land oftentimes.
Right. They're more interested in sort of where we are, where we're living, and it's probably a natural. I would argue probably a natural reaction. But I would also say that splitting. So the base form of the map splits Greenland basically in half, and it also splits Russia. And that I would argue is also very intentional, right? There's not very many people in Greenland. So therefore, not a lot of people to sort of lodge complaints against the map compared to, say, if you were to split the United States in half, there'd probably be a lot of ornery people. And then the other part would be Russia, very, very far eastern Russia, sort of Siberia area, that also gets split in half. And again, I would argue there's not that many people there. And so that's probably very intentional of like, well, we can split these without bothering too many people. I would argue probably Greenlanders don't like this map very much, at least at its base form. Still, it's also I would say it's a very cool looking map. I sometimes I just like to look at it because it has some interesting shapes and you can sort of compare things.
I mean, there's all kinds of interesting map projections that we won't get to today.
Absolutely.
There's one that sort of makes the world look like a heart, which is based on Ptolemy's description, notes from Ptolemy and the maps that he made. And then there's one that's a sort of a star projection, which the American Association of Geographers uses as their symbol as well. So there's all kinds of very curious map projections.
Yeah. And actually, we're just going to sort of wrap up our episode today, but I want to leave listeners with this. And we've talked about this website on a number of occasions, but if you ever want to look at and sort of see how things get distorted, there's a map website called truesizeof.com, or just Google true size of. And from there, you can type in any country. And for the United States, you can type in any state and sort of it'll overlay it and you can sort of drag it on top of whatever country. And as you move it around the globe, you're going to see it change and morph its size based on, well, what its actually size is compared to that landmass. So if you take Greenland, and it's a Mercator projection, very intentional Mercator projection. If you take Greenland, which looks massive, and you can drag it on down over to Africa, you can actually see how it's shrinking and really feels much smaller compared to that continent. Very cool website. I love that somebody created that.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing with Russia, which is the largest country by land area. But if you start dragging it closer to the equator, you realize it's not quite as big as many of the maps depict it to be.
Absolutely. And so with that, listener, well, I guess, Hunter, do you want to run through your whatnots?
Absolutely. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portlandist, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, with David Baines, my colleague at the university. And I'm co-host of this podcast with you, Jeff. Geography is Everything.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. You can find me, in addition to this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/little@geography by Jeff. You can also find us on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com. If you liked what you heard today, you thought this was a really fun episode, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube if you enjoyed it, or rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever app you might be listening to. All of this stuff really helps us, and we really appreciate seeing them. Next week, we have another geographic wonky episode that's kind of a tie-in to this episode, I think, and that is antipodes. Hunter, what's an antipode? Give us a little hint.
Are
little
two
brief.
points on the Earth that are directly opposite one another.
Absolutely. And so that's going to be a really fun one to explore because while this one was talking about how we sort of perceive our world, I would argue antipodes is going to be a really fun episode in sort of how each of us, me, you, all of our listeners, sort of situate themselves within our world, because it's going to help people understand what's actually on the other side of the planet directly from where you're at. Really fun episode. Again, that one we're going to do a lot of describing, and obviously the YouTube part of this will be very helpful as well, I think. And so with that, I guess, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone.